Hello everybody, welcome to Module 2 of our ED 636 class. You can see here that I have my profile picture on this slide, and it's not because in any way I like my profile picture. It's just I put that up there because I wanted to ask all of you guys to also post your profile picture if you can, if you haven't done it yet. And the reason is because I like to see you guys. I like to see what you look like. I always like to say that if we're standing in line at the grocery store together, I would like to know who you are. Plus, I think it's fun for your classmates to see who you are, especially when you're responding to each other with your discussion boards. So if you haven't done it yet, if you could put up a profile picture, that would be very helpful. And you can always ask a child to help you do it if you're not quite sure how to do it. So just a little request, if you could consider that. Thank you. Now, in last week's reading, you were reading in the text an awful lot of factors that can contribute to students having trouble with reading. And you responded to a discussion board comparing what you read to what you had already thought were contributing factors. Now, if you notice, I didn't ask you to read that entire chapter, and truthfully, I probably should have, because there were other factors mentioned in that text that you didn't read. So I wanted to take just a couple minutes and just give you highlights of some of that information that was in the text that you didn't take a look at. So we're still talking about risk factors and what can contribute to students having difficulties. And actually, I have up here, or may not, some things that we think might contribute to reading difficulties, but in actuality really may not. So the first topic for us to consider is cognitive factors. You know, what's happening in the little brains of the children that we are working with. And the first cognitive factor that we're going to talk briefly about is the notion of the intelligence quotient, or the IQ. And it might stand to reason that we might think that students that have a higher IQ would not have trouble with reading or with learning skills. However, we generally find that to be true, that students with higher IQs are going to require less practice and less time to learn new skills. So in general, that is actually true. But we also need to think that our foundational skills when we're teaching students how to read are lower level skills and can actually be acquired by students who even have the lowest of IQs. And I can tell you, case in point, that my special needs brother-in-law lives with us, and he's actually classified as a disabled adult child. And even he has skills with his very low IQ where he can read. If I leave him messages or leave him notes or, write things in cards and such to him, he is still able to read them. So even though he has a very low IQ, he has been able to gain those foundational skills. So when we're talking about those low-level skills of just decoding and learning how to get that print off the page, IQ isn't necessarily so much of a factor. However, it becomes much more of a factor as the students get older, because the skills that they're asked to do and the thinking that they're asked to do becomes much more complex. So when we get into the stages where we're asking students to do a lot more deep, inferential, complex thinking with complex text, then IQ is going to be more of a factor. And those kids with the higher IQ are generally going to need less practice to get to the thinking that we want them to get to than are those students who have the lower IQ. However, there is not necessarily a direct link between IQ and reading ability, because if we think of the many, many students that we've all seen who struggle with reading, however, we know that they are also extremely intelligent children, we can see that there really is not a direct connection between a person's IQ and their ability to read. So another cognitive factor that is sometimes thrown around is a child's preferred learning modalities. And there's existed a hypothesis in the world of education, which is actually kind of like now educational folklore, that if we determine a child's preferred learning modality and then we match our instruction to that learning modality, it's going to be much better for the students. So for instance, if we determine that a child is a visual learner and then we present their information to them always in a visual way, so that they're always seeing pictures and they're always seeing videos and that they're always getting that information through visual means, that's going to help them learn better. Where in truth, there have been many research studies, that have been conducted that find that this really isn't true for increasing reading achievement. But what we do know is true is that it's effective for all students to present information in multi-modes. So we present them information visually and auditorily and kinesthetically so that they're touching things and that they're moving. So it's certainly good for all students to be exposed to things in all modes, but it is not true that we should target certain learning modalities to students based on what their preferred learning methods are. Memory is also another cognitive factor. So if we can think in terms of memory as existing in 3 different stages, and the first stage is the sensory store, or that immediate capture of information that we have, where we get an awareness of something, and then we may or may not work with that information depending upon whether we need it. So it's just that kind of immediate capture, and then it either goes into our short or long-term memory, or it's just gone. Then we have our short-term or our working memory, and this is where we take information in for short periods of time depending upon how long we're working with it. So something will remain in our short-term memory as long as we're revisiting it and we're going back to it and we're using that information. So it will stay there in our short-term. And our short-term memory has a limited capacity, and I find it helpful to think of our short-term memory as kind of our cognitive desktop. It's the desktop that we have, so things will remain there on our desktop as long as we're working with them, and we can go back to them and we can find them easily. However, there's a limit to how much stuff we can put on that desktop, and once there's too much on that desktop, something has to go, or there isn't going to be room for anything else. So that's like our short-term memory. And then our long-term memory is where we store information that's going to stay forever, and we're going to be able to retrieve it whenever we need it at any time. So oftentimes we can think that children who have trouble reading might have a problem with their short-term or their working memory. But what actually might be happening is the students might be having so much trouble decoding words that it's taking up too much of that short-term memory, and that they then don't have enough room left over for the comprehension piece, for figuring out what it was that they read. So if they are laboriously working through words and trying to sound out individual words and get the understanding of individual words, all of that's going on their desktop and taking up room on their desktop, so that then when they get to the end, they might not just have enough room there to go back and pull it all together and figure out what it was that they read. So really what might be presenting as a short-term memory problem might actually be a fluency problem, and that what we need to do with those students is to work them to gain their skills to automaticity, so that they're not spending so much time and so much energy working with just figuring out the words on the page, because when they're doing that, all of that is ending up in their short-term memory and is taking up that room that we actually need for them to be storing bits of meaning and being able to pull that together into comprehension of the text. I hope that explanation made sense. Okay, so that was cognitive factors. Now let's consider the language factors. What are the language skills that students actually have to have in order to be successful readers? So in terms of language, we know that skills in phonology have to be in place. We know that students have to have an understanding of syntax or sentence structure. They have to understand semantics or word definitions, and they also have to understand orthography, which is actually the print. What do the print words look like, and how do the print words go together, and how does punctuation work, and all that that goes into the actual print on the page. So all of those things have to be working together in order for there to be successful reading. So now with syntax and semantics, they have a very small association actually with what eventually presents as reading delays, because if you think syntax can be taught, because we're always teaching students sentence structure and more complex sentence structure. Semantics, we're always building their vocabulary and teaching them new words. However, semantics can affect students when they have such an insufficient or such a limited vocabulary that it's interfering with reading in such a way that they can't get understanding from anything that they're reading. So vocabulary can play a part, but not so much syntax. And those problems definitely become more prevalent after the primary years because of the discussion that we just had, that the foundational skills can be built, but once we start moving and the text starts getting more complex and more difficult, we need those other skills in place. Phonology, however, is a different animal. Phonology can be a major contributing factor to reading delay at any age. And when we're talking phonology, we're talking about an understanding of a child having an understanding of phonemic awareness, meaning an understanding of sound in words, and then an understanding of phonics, which is how we connect those sounds to the different letters. So in terms of phonemic awareness, we know through a lot of research that problems in that phonemic awareness is a major factor in reading delays, because it's the very first skill really that has to be put into place in order for students to learn how to read. So it's the foundation of the foundational skills. So if we have a very weak foundation, we know what's going to happen to our building. So we have to have an understanding of phonemic awareness and an awareness that can definitely contribute to our reading delays. So remember, when we're talking about phonemic awareness, we're talking strictly about sound. Can students hear the sounds in words? So devoid of print, not looking at print at all, but just listening to words. Can they hear the sounds? And when we're doing phonemic awareness activities, on the very simple level, we're doing things like isolation, blending, and segmentation of words. So when we're talking about isolation, we're talking about if I were to say to you the word bat, what's the first sound in the word bat? And I would want you to be able to tell me B. Or blending, if I say to you the sounds in bat, if I say, listen, B, A, T, what's the word? If you can pull those sounds together and blend them together and tell me the word, that would be a blending activity. Or if I ask you to tell me the sounds in the word bat, what are the sounds in the word bat? And I would want you to tell me B, A, T, so that I could hear that you could segment that word and tell me what the individual sounds are. I might also ask you how many sounds are in a word. If we get into more complex phonemic awareness activities, we might be doing phoneme deletion, where I might say to you the word bat. What's the word bat without the B sound? And hopefully you'd be able to tell me at. Or word-to-word matching, I might say to you, do the word bat and the word book start with the same sound? Or do they end with the same sound, so that you're comparing words to words and comparing the sounds? So it's a skill that not everyone acquires, as you can see here. It can develop regardless of a student's IQ or a student's SES. It can cause problems. But the good news is that phonemic awareness can be taught at any age. So even when we see our older readers in middle school and high school that don't have those skills in place, and believe me, they exist. I just saw one this past Thursday. The good news is we can teach them. We can teach them phonemic awareness skills at any age. Now, another language factor that some people think of sometimes is the students having a non-standard dialect, so that their dialect is different than what they encounter when they are reading text. And there's been a lot of work done with that, and what research has shown is that reading achievement is not impacted by a mismatch between a student's dialect and the reading material that they're encountering. So one thing that you can think about is just the knowledge that spoken language and written language in general are completely different systems. So even if your spoken word and your written word don't match, actually they're never going to match, because we don't speak in full sentences. We don't speak in inflated vocabulary unless we're in a formal situation, because our speaking is always different than our reading. So we always have to teach certain skills with reading. So there being a mismatch between how we speak and how we read has been shown that it doesn't really affect our ability to learn how to read. Now, where dialect might interfere a little bit is what we were just talking about with phonemic awareness. So a teacher really needs to be aware of her own dialect and also the dialect of her students. And I think of a very good friend of mine who was from Louisiana. So she had a very, heavy Southern accent. And to her, the word pin and the word pen were the same word. They were all pin. So a teacher would need to be aware of that, particularly with phonemic awareness activities. to understand how they are pronouncing things. Reading history. Now this is very interesting. When we think of a child's reading history, we can think of students who have trouble acquiring those decoding skills in their early school years are almost always going to be behind the 8-ball moving forward. Because if you think about it, they have trouble decoding in their early years, so their teacher is going to spend an awful lot of time and an awful lot of energy with them on those decoding skills, because we just mentioned that we want to get those decoding skills to automaticity because we don't want to use up all the cognitive desktop space with children just trying to figure out words. So we spend a lot of our time with them getting them to decode automatically. And because we spend so much time with them on that, we have fewer opportunities to actually present them with connected text and to have them actually reading text. Not that we never do, because of course we do, but we spend much less time doing that with them than we do with the counterparts in the classroom of students who might be the same age but yet have acquired stronger reading skills. So while I'm working with my babies who need their decoding skills, I'm asking my other students to read some text that they can already read. So now look at this quote. Studies indicate that in mid-first grade, able readers may read as much as 5 times more connected text than the poorest readers during a reading lesson. Small differences in early skills grow into much larger differences over time. So those students are being exposed to more text, and then they're probably being asked those higher level questions. And as we move forward, that pattern is going to continue. In a lot of cases, not saying it's a death sentence, but in a lot of cases that's what's going to happen. And that results in what we refer to as the Matthew effect. And that's named after the biblical character Matthew, and it's connected with one of the parables. But basically the adage is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's what happens with our reading skills. And that's a problem with reading history. So really there are so many factors that come into play and that we have to consider when we're presented with students who are struggling readers that we need to work with and we need to remediate. And some of these things are fixable and some of them are not, but it's very important that we just have that awareness of them and, a thought of what could be the problem here, because understanding what the problem is can often help us with what are the strategies we're going to use to help them. And so, now going forward in the module, I wanted us to think that we don't want to feel totally discouraged and totally down when we're thinking about our students who come to us from low SES backgrounds, because that often presents us with those factors that we can't control. So I don't want us thinking that, well, we're doomed. We can't help them, because that's absolutely not true. So what I'm doing is I'm providing you with this article, Effective Reading Programs in Low-Income Schools, that I would like you to read. And then I've given you 2 videos about schools that are turnaround schools that are in very low-income areas. And I want you to take a look at what are some of the things that they did to work intensely with those students, knowing that those students were in a situation where things are going to be difficult for them. And, what could they do to help them? Okay, and then after you look at that, come back to me with another video. We're going to talk about identifying those students that are at risk early and as early as we possibly can, so that we can provide them with the assistance that they need as soon as we can. Okay, so I'll see you guys in a little bit.